Good morning, folks. This is Shannon Guernsey with Minnesota NAHRO, and welcome once again to the Online Maintenance and Property Managers Series. This is our fourth session, and we are welcoming back Warren Duncan with the Training Institute. And he is going to be talking to us about strategies and approaches and on how to communicate with folks who have experienced trauma. And I know for many of you, you have are in the role that you have, you communicate with tenants all the time. And we know that some of those folks can be challenging or puzzling at times, and perhaps some of it is because of the trauma that they have experienced earlier in their lives. So we hope that you find this training useful. Again, for many of you, I think it will confirm things that you already know, or maybe provide some more insights to things that you have observed happening. And most importantly, I hope that it will provide a couple of ideas or approaches that might make the work that you do a little bit easier, because what you do is incredibly important. So with that, I'll say thank you for joining us. We are recording this, and so just wanted to let you know, I know many of you are already on. I will be managing the chat, so if you have a question, please feel free, or a comment, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I believe, Warren, we're going to have some interactive periods along the way. So yeah, be ready to chime in on that chat if possible. And again, look forward to this session with you. We'll adjourn no later than 10 o'clock this morning. And let's see, I think that's it for the logistics. And so with that, I will turn it over to Warren. And again, welcome all.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, my name's Warren Duncan. I'm one of the instructors at the Training Institute. Share with you a little bit about myself, just starting with my work history. I've worked in the nonprofit sector for, over 2 decades now. I'm not going to lie to you. It feels a little weird to say that. The bulk of my career has been in supportive housing for households who have a long history of homelessness. I've worked in direct care in shelter settings, in site-based settings, in scattered site supportive housing, meaning that we were a mobile team providing support services and utilizing the private market for housing. I've also had a number of leadership roles. I was a regional manager for some permanent supportive housing programs in greater Minnesota. I've been a program director before I took this position at the Training Institute, overseeing support services and funding along those lines across different types of agencies in Minnesota. And I was also a lobbyist for 12 years, a Minnesota lobbyist, advocating for policy change and additional resources to address issues around homelessness. So I've done a lot. In every program that I've been associated with, they leaned heavily on housing first and harm reduction models, strategies in the service approach. And they did that because those are considered evidence-based best practices when engaging with participants who have a long history of homelessness, multiple barriers to maintaining stable housing. Now, what do I mean when I say evidence-based? It means that they looked at programs that utilized those strategies and they compared them to programs that did not. And what they found was that programs that utilize those strategies have better outcomes, essentially meaning that participants in those programs were able to maintain their housing. More participants were able to maintain their housing compared to programs that did not utilize those strategies. Now, it doesn't mean every program, that would use harm reduction and housing first engagement principles was able to maintain their housing. And it doesn't mean that no participants were able to maintain their housing in programs that didn't utilize those strategies. But what it means is that more households were able to maintain their housing. Now, what does that have to do with today's topic? Understanding trauma, being trauma informed, utilizing trauma informed practices is the backbone on why those strategies were so effective. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Share a little bit of myself outside my work history. Sorry, that photo always cracks me up. Share a little bit more about myself just so that you can better understand where I come from, how I see things. I was born in Iowa. Maybe you guys hear my Iowa accent. I consider myself son to my mother. I'm the father to 2 kids. Please don't ask me how old they are because I don't even know. Time is going by so quickly. I consider myself a partner to my wife. I identify as a light-skinned heterosexual man. However, I'm not Anglo. I'm Chicano. I grew up in a bilingual household. So you may or may not know Chicano is just a category in the Latinx community. So my family is from Texas. A long time ago, the border moved on them. You may be thinking, how does the border move on someone? Well, one day they were Mexicans, and the next day they became Texans. Eventually, they became U.S. citizens. Over our culture and our traditions, they stayed the same. Both of my grandparents were born in the U.S., but neither of them spoke English because they didn't have to. Now, you may also be thinking, well, gee, Warren, that's nice and all. Why are you telling me all this? I'm sharing this stuff about myself with you, again, so that you can better understand where I come from, how I see things. I'm guessing it's probably different than how you see things, right? We probably don't see things exactly the same way. And you know what? That's okay. That's better than okay. That's why I love facilitating these workshops, because I learn from you. Now I'm going to go through the slides and I'm going to be sharing, I'm going to be talking based on my lens, right? My experience at work, my life history. But I'd love to hear how you see the material, right? How you can apply the material to your work. And with a topic like trauma, maybe outside of your work too. And that way we have this great shared learning experience. However, you don't have to, right? That's up to you. We have these content disclaimers as a trauma-informed practice in the training arena, right? The training room, the virtual room that we're in. So I want to give you just a heads up that we'll talk about trauma, and sometimes that may bring things up for yourself. If it does, you have my permission to do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. Now I'm going to do a short break in the middle of today's training just to give us a chance to use the restroom, get something to drink, something to eat, like not have our eyes just focused on a screen for 2 hours straight. But if you need to take a break before that, feel free to do that. If you need to mute me, go ahead and mute me if you're feeling bothered. When we're emotionally activated, it takes us out of the learning capacity. And I imagine that's counter to why you signed up today. So you're in charge of your learning. So let's start off, right? Enough of my yammering, right? Hop into the material. The first thing we're going to talk about is kind of the philosophy of being trauma informed, right? Of understanding trauma. Philosophy, right? That's the study of the fundamental nature of knowledge. It's also a theory or attitudes held by a person or organization that acts as a guiding principle for behavior. So we're going to use our understanding of trauma as a lens for viewing the participants that we work with. It's going to guide us on how to best work with them. So first, let's define what I mean by trauma. I have two definitions here to review with you. Here's the first. A traumatic experience involves a threat to one's physical or emotional well-being and elicits intense feelings of helplessness, terror, and lack of control. Now, this is from the American Psychiatric Association. Check out this date, 2000, right? It's 2023 now. This date, or this definition, is over 20 years old. Wow. You know, if this definition was a person, it could legally buy beer in all 50 US states. You know, but I still think it really captures what we're talking about with what does trauma mean. Now, the one thing that I would add to this definition, it involves a threat. This could be a perceived threat, right? It doesn't have to be objectively real. It's the perception of someone that makes something traumatic, not the event itself. Now, I have a second definition. It's a little newer that pairs with this, right? An experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. Think about that second definition, right? We all have capacity to deal with adversity. That's life, right? But what about when we experience something that goes beyond our coping skills, right? We can't just walk around the block, right? Or do some deep breathing to write it out. It's too much. That can be a traumatic experience for someone. And think about our capacity, right? That can get worn down too. If we're experiencing lots of stressors, or if we're not getting the right nutrition or adequate sleep. So I got a little excited there, right? When we're out of balance, we may be less likely to cope with the big stressor. Now, I'm not just talking about participants here. When I'm defining trauma, I'm talking about people. So you're included in here, right? Our capacity to cope varies. Right, I just read this great book a couple months ago that talked about our capacity, like the size of our cup. As we deal with more stress, our cup starts to fill, it compounds, like filling this cup with water. And this cup size, like I said, it changes day to day, even situation to situation. So think about, what does it feel like when your cup is half full, when it's close to overflowing? So I got this great tool. This is developed by this man named Dr. Dan Siegel. He is a neuroscientist out of Berkeley, and he came up with this scale called the window of tolerance. So if you look at this window of tolerance, if we have capacity, and this line is just kind of our hormone reaction level here, but we have capacity to be able to deal with tough situations and still maintain our equanimity, right? Being able to be calm, being able to be present. But when we fall outside of this window, and there's two ways that we can fall outside of it, we can become more escalated, right? Prone to more outbursts, yelling, right? We get in our big emotions. We can also fall below, where we start to shut down, right? Get more withdrawn, maybe even disassociate from the situation because you're too overwhelmed. And so this is what happens when we're not able to cope with the situation. And I mentioned that this can be different it's different for different people, right? But for even that same person, it can be different per situation. I'll give you a quick example. So let's say I'm working and my boss gives me a bunch of jobs that I have to do and not really a lot of time to do that. So I have to really buckle down to get all this work done. Now, I'm not happy about it, right? I'm not smiling, but I'm able to stay within my window of tolerance. I'm still able to be professional, right? I'm not giving outbursts. I'm not hollering. I'm not shutting down. Now let's take, a different situation where maybe I'm talking to somebody close to me, my brother, right? And we're talking about something we're passionate about, but it's still pretty benign, like baseball. Now, a little bit of self-disclosure, huge Twin fan, right? I'm a big Twins fan. My brother, he's a big Royals fan, right? We grew up in Iowa, so it's just like I went north, he went south to Kansas City. And let's say we get into a disagreement. I may fall outside of my window of tolerance. I laugh because I usually do, like, get really heated, when we're talking about baseball. And my brother doesn't agree, or maybe he says something that belittles me, and that strikes something that's sensitive to me, right? And that brings me outside of my window of tolerance. And so those are just examples. The opposite could happen too. My brother says something that I hear is belittling, and I just shut down. Does that make sense? So I want to introduce to you a tool for when this happens, right? When we fall outside of our window of tolerance. And like I said, this window varies in size, right? Based on our current coping skills, if we've had enough sleep, if we're eating right, the support that we have helps this window, right? When we know there's more people on our side, or our friends or our family kind of help us out, we're able to widen this window. But when we fall outside of our window, there are things that we can do. So I'm going to introduce our first trauma-informed practice. Like in many situations, being trauma-informed starts with you, right? Knowing where you are, leading with presence and awareness. That's needed to be trauma-informed, especially when we're first kind of starting out, right, in the world, but also when we think we know things, right? So grounding is a practice that can help you pull away from negative or challenging emotions. These techniques may help distract you from what you're experiencing and refocus on what's happening in the present moment, right? Grounding helps bring us back to be present. In this instance, keep us in our learning capacity. Like I said, I'm a big believer in just leading with presence and awareness. When you feel yourself just experiencing a strong emotional response around a stressor, grounding is going to be the tool that can help deactivate you, right? Allow you to be present. And I'm imagining that many of you already utilize grounding tools. So I'll share with you, and again, when I disclose stuff about myself, it's really for the learning purposes. So I grew up in Des Moines. I grew up in a working class Italian neighborhood. I went to parochial school, Catholic school. And I remember the first time that I was introduced a grounding tool by one of the teachers, right? Sister Sorensen. All the teachers were nuns or priests where I grew up. And I remember Sister Sorensen would tell me to stop and to count to 10 when I had really big feelings, usually about something that the Scigliano brothers were up to. They were a couple of knuckleheads when I was growing up. But she'd tell me to count to 10 before saying something, right? Before reacting. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but she was helping me introduce putting some space in, pausing. right? So that I could get back to that window of tolerance, not have that big strong reaction. So you see, here are some of the categories. There's some physical things that you can do for grounding, rubbing your hands together, right? Maybe noticing where your body meets the gravity, like if your feet are on the floor, just putting your focus on there. Or if you're sitting down, right, noticing your butt on the chair, just noticing that. That is a grounding technique. You could also do something visually, look around, um, notice what you see, count colors, right? Or there are mental grounding techniques, thinking of your favorite food, imagining what it smells like. Those are things that help us stay centered. My big one now is focusing on my breath, deep breathing, right? When I notice my face starting to, let's say I'm getting upset, so my face starts to get flush, maybe I'm having thoughts of, oh, this isn't working out. I can take some deep breaths, right? And that'll help me stay centered. In the chat box, I'd love to know some of the things that you all do when you're feeling upset to stay grounded. Maybe it's, something like counting to 10, like what Sister Sorensen taught me. Or maybe it's something like physical, as far as going on a walk, right? Yoga, whatever physical activity, running, right? That helps you stay centered. Again, here are some other grounding techniques that you can use. And I want to challenge you, as I have some of these examples up here. If you don't do something, or if you have a go-to grounding technique, pick a new one and give it a try. See if it works for you. Try it for a couple weeks. Try it when you're starting to feel some strong feelings around the situation, and see if it helps you stay in that present moment. Nobody wants to share things that they do. I hear you. It's early, right? Yelling serenity now. Clay County, you're hilarious. Well, and I really appreciate kind of you saying that too, because sometimes this is looked at, oh, is that like some kind of a new age thing, or is that some kind of like a yogi thing? That's not me. And really what I'm trying to communicate is these are tools that work, and to try it out for yourself. It's from Seinfeld. Oh, how did I not know that? I used to watch Seinfeld all the time. Itasca County. And let me know if you want me to call you by your name. I'm just calling you on here. But yeah, regulation for your kids. So try to stay ahead of changes. Absolutely. In fact, you'll see a lot of the tools that we have in here. I've heard say, well, Warren, this really sounds like I'm parenting kids. And it's like, yeah, a lot of these are kind of the same idea, right? I'll use this term dysregulated. And so that would be if we fall outside of that window of tolerance, right? And so what we're trying to do is to help folks get back in here. For those of you that were at de-escalation, I think that was the first training that we did. We talk about system 1 and system 2, right? And our big emotions fall in system 1. That's our emotional reaction response. System 2 was our rational side. And so with trauma, a lot of times that window of tolerance is small. And so it's easy to fall outside of that. This is a great book. I have this, I'm going to share with you at the end a couple of documents, a couple of handouts, but one of them is our post-class discussion. And it has all the information that I cover today. So everything on the key slides, but it also has a list of resources for you to follow up on after today's class. This is one of the resources, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. This is one of the best books on how trauma impacts us. What does it mean, right? It's not just having a bad day, right? Or a bad week. But it's about as far as how we can be really impacted, our health, our even our structures of our brain, which I'll go to in a bit. So being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, unchanged and immutable, as every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past. So this is a pretty, it's, I gave you the definition of trauma, and this is a pretty crude way to explain like how trauma stays in our brain, but I think it's accurate. So think of our brains as filing cabinets, right? We have new memories, they become files that we file away, right? When something is as traumatic, that memory doesn't get filed away. It keeps popping up. Everything reminds us of the trauma, right? So that file, right, just keeps, it's like it's still on your desk, and it's like that trauma is still happening. That makes sense. And so, when someone goes to treatment, they work to try to process those memories so they don't stay in the brain, but they can be filed to the long-term memories, if that makes sense. That's a good transition for this next slide. This is one of my favorite slides that we have. So I talked about how trauma impacts us. I want to get into that a little bit more. Trauma physically changes our brain, right? When we've been exposed to repeated chronic trauma, complex trauma, that changes how we see the world. The amygdala, that little red thing that wiggles, that's the part of our brain that's responsible for big emotions, for identifying threats. That gets bigger. You guys like that? I stayed up late last night. getting that piece of the brain to get big. Now it doesn't get as big as I illustrated here. Like, this is for training purposes, but it gets bigger. So what do you think that means? Someone is more likely to see something as a threat. They're more likely to respond to something with big emotions. For me, in the work that I did, when I started picking up on this, because a lot of participants I worked with, they had multiple barriers to stable housing. They were in and out of crisis, repeatedly exposed to just traumatic events. I would be careful with the words that I used. For one thing, I would try to keep a softer voice, again, perceived as a threat. I would watch my body language. I didn't use the word no when I worked with participants. Why would I not use the word no? Because the word no could be perceived as a threat. Now, that didn't mean that I didn't have to put limits, but I was very careful not to use the word no. A lot of times I would say yeah to put a little bit of space, and then say kind of things that might be getting in the way. That worked really well for me, but it was always based on how strong of a working relationship did I have with someone. So I joke around sometimes when I'm trying to illustrate like what this could look like if like you're talking to someone about like a pretty benign subject, like let's say it's the evolution of Taylor Swift's musical career. And don't get me wrong, like she's really evolved, right? These past 12 years. She's no joke. But like that conversation goes from a 3 to an 11 like that. And you're like, whoa, we're just talking about Taylor Swift, right? This is why. Trauma also impacts the hippocampus. Now, this part of the brain does a lot. It's responsible for spatial navigation, but it's also responsible for converting the short-term memories to long-term memories. When someone's experienced chronic trauma, this gets weaker. It shrinks. So what do you think that means, right? I remember working with a gentleman, and he had a long history of homelessness. He was like living on the streets, and this was in the metro area for like 20 years. And I remember he was sharing with me a situation that he experienced, and I mean, I really felt for him, right? Like it wasn't a good situation. And I remember his emotions were really raw. He was acting like it had just happened, like that morning, that event, or like the day before. But in reality, it happened like over 15 years prior to when he shared it with me. This is why. Learning new things, right? For someone that's experienced chronic trauma, that can be difficult. People can become easily overwhelmed. And so that brings me to the prefrontal cortex. This is a part of our brain that's responsible for executive functioning, for planning, for empathy, being able to see what other people, being able to, guess what other people are thinking or feeling from their point of view. This goes offline. Now, it doesn't disappear like I did in the illustration, but what it means is it's kind of like a window on the computer, right? When I minimize that window, it goes away, I don't see it. Doesn't mean that it's not there. It's still there. I'm just not seeing it. So the prefrontal cortex is kind of what helps soothe the amygdala, right? That connection to the amygdala gets weaker. And so when the prefrontal cortex goes offline, what's in charge? The amygdala, right? The big emotions, the threats. When I worked with participants and we moved into housing, this was always the awesome day. They were excited. A lot of the households I worked with, they were also scared. A lot of guys I talked with, it was like fear of failure, were reasons. But, there's all this paperwork we have to sign for the lease. And I utilized subsidies through HUD or Minnesota Housing for the participant. So there's a lot of paperwork there. And oftentimes participants would get overwhelmed with all this stuff. And so one of the things that I learned that I started doing in my role in housing, and I know it's a little different from your guys' role, but I would take the stuff on the lease and I would really condense it down into more plain speak, bullet points. And I would talk about what do we need to do to be able to maintain you living in the apartment. And we just write it down, right? And usually I would tape the paper, or if it was on a sticky note, like one of those big sticky notes, I would put it someplace that they would see it all the time, knowing that they may not get everything because of what's going on in the brain. Usually I put it on the fridge. And it's where they could repeatedly see it. These are tools that really worked well for me. A lot of times I would revisit, or when I was in my director role, when we would have the teams that we worked with, would revisit important things around the lease, like maybe the grievance or around the subsidy work, like maybe the grievance policy. We'd repeat it, in different visits to make sure that they understood everything. Now, we were very careful not to sound like we were talking down to them or patronizing them, by saying it over and over again, but we wanted to make sure that it clicked. And we normalized how it is easy to get overwhelmed when you're having a big life change, like as far as being unhoused to being housed. And I found that was very helpful. Any thoughts about the brain? Is this new for y'all, or is it something that you've been aware of? One thing that I also want to share, how many of you watch this? It's a YouTube show called Cosmic Kids Yoga. Am I the only one? Darlene, it's a great reminder. Nice. So there's this show I watch with my kids. I'm being a little bit facetious by saying that I watch it, but I do watch it with my girls. It's fantastic. They have a video where it talks about the different parts of our brain. They talk about there's two parts. There's the wise owl, which is the prefrontal cortex part of the brain. If you were at the de-escalation training and we have Kahneman's model, it's the system 2. But I like wise owl because it makes more sense, right? It's what the wise owl does. And then the other part of the brain, right, the system 1 in the Kahneman's model is referred to as the guard dog. I really like that guard dog bit because I think it, a lot of times we hear this is bad, right? This is good, right? Prefrontal cortex good, amygdala bad. No, it's different. And so I like guard dog because when I worked with participants that had a long history of homelessness in and out of crisis, the guard dog is what helped them survive. But now that we're in housing, that's starting to get in the way. Oh, nice. Your girls love Cosmic Kids Yoga too. It's a great channel. So that I love that video because even though it was directed at kids, like to me as an adult, it makes a lot of sense. And so just think about when we're working with participants and they have these struggles, they endured this trauma, their guard dog is now like really easy to come out. And we really have to work to tease out the wise owl. Now I have this great video I want to show you. I'm only going to show you a couple minutes clips. This is from a TED Talk. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. She is a physician. I have to update this slide. She was Surgeon General up until 2022 of California. She's no longer the Surgeon General, but she's a great author on books around trauma. She has a documentary, Wrestling Ghosts. So she's going to talk about her first experience hearing about this thing called ACEs, adverse childhood events. And she's going to explain what that means. I'm imagining many of you are already familiar with it, but she's going to talk about how that impacted her and the work that she did. So just listen for that, and we'll talk about the clip together in just a couple minutes. It's only a few minutes long. I think it's like 3 minutes.
It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do.
So I was just writing down a couple of things that really stand out for me. I think of who we're working with in supportive housing, folks that need to utilize subsidies or have that extra support services. They've had a lot of adversity in childhood, right? And that impacts their health as adults. But one of the things that she talks about there is, I love that bear analogy. And she talks about how our stress response system, right, is developed to be able to cope with a threat like a bear in the woods. But what about when we're seeing threats everywhere in the real world? And so for me, I think of in my program, and then she talked about, like, once she understood the impact, right, of how this adversity kind of changed the structure of the participant, they threw out what they used to do, right? They started doing things differently. And what I heard there is, so that they don't appear to be the bear. And I think that's great for us. And how does that apply to us, right? We understand that participants that have experienced trauma as a child, when they're adults, right, their brains they're wired differently than those that didn't, right? Those brains are wired to deal with this nearly constant stress, right? And what does that mean? Well, it means that a lot of times participants really struggle to respond appropriately to situations that would otherwise appear normal or non-threatening to someone that didn't have, right, that chronic stress as a child. And so that, to me, partially explains why many adult trauma survivors struggle with stuff like depression, anxiety, and other issues related to emotional regulation, right? And that those mental health issues can contribute to long-term difficulties maintaining healthy relationships and lead to a lot of issues at school or at work. So as providers, we need to do things differently, like Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris did, throw out the old ways that we do things once we understand this, so that we don't have the appearance of the bear. Does that make sense? Here's a list of symptoms of trauma, and just make a mental note if you want to in the chat box. Type in what you see with the participants that you work with. I know that might be overwhelming, because participants that I worked with in supportive housing, folks that had a long history of homelessness, they met Minnesota's definition of long-term homeless, or HUD's chronic homeless definition. They had almost all of these. One thing that I want to note, take depression here. Someone could be experiencing these symptoms, right, like depression, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's due to trauma. However, experiencing trauma could induce these symptoms, right? And these symptoms can intertwine. Most likely we're not just seeing one thing, right? We're seeing lots of things. It's probably looking pretty complicated. And so think about your participants, what they're experiencing. what do you think someone who's experiencing insomnia here, what do you think someone might notice about them during the day if they're having trouble sleeping at night? Maybe we might notice that they're a little irritable, or maybe that they're having a hard time focusing. Maybe they're having issues around maintaining their hygiene. Think about that. What about if someone was experiencing, numbing? What would that look like? Well, maybe they're not present, or maybe they just say, I don't care, right? When you're talking with them. Maybe they're cutting, right? Or doing some kind of a self-injury just to feel something. Maybe there's substance use involved, right? So just think about that. When you look at these symptoms, well, these are nice, neat lists, but what do they look like in your work, right? What does mistrust look like with the people that you work with? One thing I want to say, that even though I listed these symptoms in this nice order, this isn't what they look like in real life, right? Oftentimes they look like this. Really chaotic. Sometimes things are felt more, only to fade into the background, be replaced by another symptom, or to manifest at another time. Sometimes they look like this, right? Like someone's an empty shell. Like they may look fine, they may seem normal, maybe they're masking it. Maybe they haven't experienced the event as traumatic. Maybe it's their normal. Example of this is a good friend of mine grew up in a neighborhood of concern. And so when they hear gunshots, that's not traumatic to them, like it would be to me. Like I'd be like, what? You know what I mean? Like I would be on edge if I heard gunshots in the neighborhood, but for them, they're used to it. Now, for them being shot, that would be traumatic. So again, trauma can manifest many different ways, right? Loud and chaotic to nothing at all. And the key here is what we want to use is we want to be curious. Curiosity here, that's the big thing, right? Symptoms can look like many, many different things. Maybe an angsty teenager, maybe depression, maybe anger issues, right? Someone can just seem like they're in a bad mood all the time, or someone acts like everything's fine and normal when everything isn't fine and normal. And so curiosity helps us not miss what might really be going on under the surface, right? And when I would talk to providers that I worked with in support services, I would make them aware as far as we need to be curious, because we may need to do things a little bit differently. Maybe make different referrals, maybe avoid triggers or situations that can recreate aspects of what was originally traumatic, right? We need to know the bigger picture of what's really going on here. And so I ask you to take the time to think about that. How does someone show up to their housing? Because sometimes, and I'm not saying you, but I've seen it, folks get labeled. They get labeled as being resistant, difficult, right? Unengaged, attention seeking. And so we have to just say, oh, why is someone presenting this to me this way? Because oftentimes it can be our own mindset about the person's bad behaviors, and that's what gets in the way. And so part of this morning, what I'm talking about is having that right mindset about trauma and how it can present. Now, I don't want you to confuse this with trauma treatment. Trauma treatment is what to do to treat the trauma, right? To process that memory so that it no longer keeps showing up. And don't get me wrong, trauma treatment is super interesting, but that's not what we're talking about today, right? We're talking about being trauma informed. That means how to be with someone who's experienced trauma, right? Being around them, understanding how trauma impacts them, what those symptoms could be, what they look like in behaviors, and then organizing, here's organizing services, but you think of organizing our policies, our procedures, so that we don't re-traumatize someone, all the while maintaining this hope for post-traumatic growth. Here it's attitude of hope for recovery, but being able to move beyond that initial trauma. Does that make sense? So I have another definition for you, and we're going to take a break in about 10 minutes. But I want to cover, oftentimes you hear this is trauma-informed care. And one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes care isn't the right word. So we're talking about as being trauma-informed. So I took the liberty of adjusting this definition. Maxine Harris is one of the initial individuals that identified the importance of trauma-informed care. But like I said, care isn't always the right word for what we do. Harris came from the healthcare field, right? Behavioral health, but being trauma-informed goes beyond human services, healthcare, right? So a system whose primary mission is altered by virtue of knowledge about trauma and the impact it has on the lives of people receiving services. Doing things differently all the time to prevent re-traumatization, send positive messages, and promote healing. So you see I highlighted impact, right? Re-traumatization, healing. We want to get away from saying, what's wrong with you? That's a natural reaction that we can have when there's something that's a little puzzling, but we want to reframe that as what happened to you. Does that make sense? You guys picking up what I'm putting down? So remember, it's the experience of the event, not the event itself, that's re-traumatizing. And so we have to remember that a trauma survivor's behaviors are this creative, brilliant adaptations, right? But that can be personally costly. If we overlook the trauma, if we see just the behaviors, labeling them bad behaviors or God, right? That's going to limit the possibility of change. Now, I'm trying to figure out the best way to articulate this so I don't stick my foot in my mouth, which I often do. Sometimes I hear folks say, Warren, you know what? I just don't want to deal with it. I don't know. Why do I have to change the way that I do things? I just want to get the job done, right? I need to do X, Y, and Z, and this is just getting in the way of that. I imagine there's some form of that you guys may relate to that statement. Let me know if I'm wrong. But for those of you that are thinking, I can't change what I need to do because I just need to get in to do the job done, I'm going to suggest that a little bit of effort as far as in your approach in looking at policies not to cause re-traumatization, that's going to improve the relationship, the working relationship, but it's also going to save you time. Because when, I go back to that window of tolerance, like if there's something, again, that someone perceives, or they didn't know, as far as like what was going on, they fall outside of that window, it's going to take more time. We're going to have to then move into our de-escalation tools, right? And when we're having a trauma-informed approach, we're consistent. And I have a document that I'll share with you too at the end. And Shannon mentioned this in the comment. That's an assessment tool for us to be able to measure how we're doing things. But I think of some of the folks that I worked with in the past, like maintenance staff, some of you that I believe are part of that. Like when we utilize trauma-informed principles, right? When we know that when we go to a site, we identify ourselves, we say the reason that we're there, right? Maybe we're wearing a uniform or a name tag that shows that we're part of a staff. That's all about promoting safety, right? And again, those are, now we're making sure that we're accommodating as far as to minimize the chance of re-traumatizing those that we're working with. So that makes sense? Feel free to ask questions or to push back. So let's take a short 5-minute break. I have 8:56 on my clock. Let's come back at 9:01. All right, so short break, use the restroom, get something to drink, right? Please don't look at your screen. I want to be mindful of your screen time. I will see you back at 9:01. In the training that really stuck out for you, and feel free to unmute. It seems like we're a small enough group too, that if you're more comfortable talking than using the chat box, go ahead and do that. But I'd be curious. You know, we talked about a lot of stuff. That's probably part of the reason I give these short little breaks, is just to let us think about some of the material that we covered. Anyone willing to share? And it's okay if you don't want to share, but I want you just to reflect on like what we talked about. What does that mean? Where's some value that I've seen? So let's look at this picture. Oh man. And maybe this this picture brings back memories for you. Like, you know, for me, it looks just like how I remember St. Anthony's Catholic. Why is it that one environment, right, in this case, a school, is absolutely no problem for some people, right, and very difficult for others? Maybe for some of us, it's a little bit in between, right? So consider this just as an example, right? There's a white kid from Edina, right? She shows up at school. Her teacher looks like her mom, maybe kind of sounds like her mom. Her mom told her what to expect, and it looks just like she expected. Her mom told her to trust the teacher. And since it's all so familiar, she just can drop in quite quickly. Now let's contrast that with another kid. Maybe a kid who's a refugee. And this is just an example. And their English is poor. This whole scenario is different, right? It's not so easy for that refugee kid just to slip into the role of a student and trust everything that's going on, right? For that kid, they might not be able to do multiplication because they can't focus on the numbers, because they don't feel safe. Now, that's a really shaky foundation, isn't it? So let's talk about some common re-traumatizations, right? What does re-traumatize mean? To put it simply, a re-traumatization is something that happens or is perceived that fires off our stress response as if the trauma was still happening, right? And this isn't meant to be a complete list, right? This is just designed to illustrate the broader points, but there's two avenues of re-traumatization. There's the system, it's our policies, procedures, the way we do things, and there's our personal relationship, right? Meaning our working relationship, our interactions with the participant, right? And within that, there's power, control, right? I'm the staff, you're the tenant, or I'm the worker, you're the tenant. And so these are what they could look like. And go ahead and look these over, right? And again, this is more general, but there are elements. I know when I look over here, there's elements that I've seen, like looking at the system, prior to coordinated entry, we would reach out to, outreach workers and other staff that may be connected to someone that has a long history of homelessness, county staff. And the participants, from what I heard, had to constantly tell their story over and over again as they were trying to get services, right? Things are very siloed. And so a lot of the different supports that they were getting didn't talk to each other. In fact, that was part of the design of the programs that I worked with, was to be able to connect the different services that the participants in our program had in their life, to help them navigate that. Oftentimes when I would take someone to, like a medical visit or like urgent care or the ER, they'd be given a number. And I remember participants always communicated to me how that kind of felt devaluing. I've heard that more than one time. But at the same time, I understood why, the healthcare clinic would give them a number for privacy, right? HIPAA compliance, for continuity of care, to make sure, that they get care. But that still impacted, done for a good reason, but that still impacted the participant that I worked with, right? The perception and services or treatment, right? Again, it's the perceived, how they perceive this in a relationship, right? The working relationship, not being heard, not being seen, violations of trust. I think of, a lot of times participants, tenants, they may disclose something to us. And in my line of work and support services, what do? We would tell the team, or maybe we would tell another provider, like, if they disclose something to us, maybe we feel we'd have to tell their mental health worker, right? Their therapist. That can be seen as a violation of trust. There's this communication tool I learned a lot about it when I was a lobbyist in Minnesota, but it's called nonviolent communication. It was developed by this guy named Marshall Rosenberg. Maybe you've heard of it. The gist of it is, we all have these basic needs or core values. And everything we do in life, all our behaviors are just strategies to make sure those needs are met. Does that make sense? And so when you think about some of our most basic needs, and I'm talking basic, to matter, to be someone, to be heard. And so if participants are perceiving that they're not heard, that's really going to impact them. So what do they got to do to be heard? Maybe they raise their voice. Maybe they're repeating themselves, right? And so if we can't, and I'm going to recognize that sometimes there's not a whole lot that we can do with the system, right? There are systemic issues that are beyond our control, but we do have a lot of control in our working relationship. And so utilizing tools like things that help somebody feel heard or to matter, acknowledge them, maybe paraphrase what they think they mean so that we can understand. Doesn't mean that we're agreeing with them when we do this, but we're understanding where they're coming from. Right? We watch what we say. You know, it's not just what you say that matters, but it's how you say that matters. And so think about, as far as in your line of work, and again, I know these are broad categories, but what are things that either on the system side, on the relations side, that could be perceived as re-traumatizing? I did this workshop and I had this slide with a group of first responders and firefighters. It was a really interesting crowd. Many of them were like stone faced. I say a joke, you know, a lot of times people laugh or they interact, but they were like, so I always thought that was funny. But when we were doing this, and I said, like, what are things that you do that could be re-traumatizing? I remember a group told me, well, Warren, for safety, when we're transporting people, sometimes depending on what's going on, we have to strap them down. And I never really thought about it, but like that is really re-traumatizing. And again, you know what I mean? It's their policy, it's the procedures, but just starting to have that understanding on how that could really impact someone that has a history of trauma, right? And how it impacts them, that strapping them down may cause that re-traumatization. Think about how that shows up with the work that you're doing, right? And just think about, as far as, you know, one thing I want to encourage y'all is to find time to review the materials that I talked with you today, whether it's at your next team meeting with your team, or maybe you make a date with yourself and you go to a coffee shop like later this week or early next week, and think about, as far as, what are some of the things that we're doing that could potentially be perceived as re-traumatizing? You know, so I shared those first responders. But even when I think about the work that I did, you know, in housing, getting private information for administering a subsidy, that could be a form of re-traumatization. I know a lot of times with the participants, I went in part of my role, and I really love this, is I got to sit in on listening sessions or conduct focus groups with program participants to get their perspective on the support services and the rental assistance subsidy, on how they saw it. And some of that involved, as far as them sharing that providers, that's what we called the support services workers, but the providers always felt they had to go into our apartment and I didn't want them in there, you know, and it's just like, and so it led to conversation. And I remember kind of hearing the workers saying, and I know it might be different in your situation, but I have to meet in the apartment because I got to make sure everything's in working order and stuff like that. And when we looked at our policy around rental assistance, well, that only had to be done at HQS, right? When we were doing the housing quality inspection, right? That's only got to be done at certain times of the year for administration. It doesn't have to be the whole time. And so if someone wants to meet outside of that apartment, that's their right. But when you insist and force yourself into someone's home, here we go to the perception of power and control. That could be re-traumatizing. And so think about how that is in your line of work, right? Any thoughts around that? Feel free to push back too. You know, if you see things a little bit differently, I totally recognize that. I've done work in housing, but it's not the same type of work that you're doing. So here at the Training Institute, we've developed our own trauma-informed assessment tool, right? And it's a way for you to see how you're doing. This is a tool that we've developed through conversations with different providers, different programs that are out there, and reviewing the literature and research that's currently available. And there's 5 principles. It's almost like a journey because they build on each other. Now I'm going to drop a PDF version in the chat box for you. Oh, maybe I can't do that. Oh no, I can't because I'm co-host. Oh, that's okay. This is a good practice for me to be resilient. I have the forms up here and I've already shared them with Shannon, and she's going to share them with you after today. Maybe she's already shared them with you. And so these 5 categories, it's like a journey. And so I want you, as we go through these, to think of a couple things, right? 2 things. The first one is, what are you already doing that aligns with being trauma informed? Because I'm imagining many of you are already doing a lot of this work, right? You've been doing it for a while. You figured out, right? That there are certain things you do that help you better connect with people or to avoid episodes that could be escalating, right? So what is that? And then the next thing I want you to think about is at least one thing that's easy that you can implement right away. Does that make sense? Now, you may have noticed when you look at these categories: safety, choice, collaboration, empowerment, trustworthiness. You may notice there's not a clear category for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why do you think we would admit that? Well, don't worry, we didn't. We didn't admit that because those concepts are interwoven into each of these categories, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, like that's not a separate thing. That's more of an umbrella approach. To me, I think of trainings like, that we talk about in culturally responsive practices or person-centered principles, right? That's a big part of this. Same with being trauma-informed, right? Our goal is to understand, right? And to connect. We want to minimize re-traumatization. Well, how can we do that if we don't acknowledge the differences between us and how that might impact someone's perception? So we do need to be cognizant about diversity, equity, inclusion, and what that means at every level of service. So let's get into this first category, safety, right? Let me give you a huge hint. Like with these concepts, you can look them up online like we did. Here's the dictionary definition of safety. But the trauma-informed thing to do is to ask tenants how they define safety, right? And what safety means to them, and then listen. What's really interesting is like when you do that, and I had a colleague share with me that the participant, the tenant, the client, they may be surprised when you ask the question. A lot of times they don't know how to best answer it right away because not a lot of people don't ask a lot of times, but that's the trauma-informed thing to do. You look here and we talk about safety, and there's 2 big categories, right? There's physical safety, emotional safety. And there can be a difference, right? Emotional safety, having trust in the environment, giving people the benefit of the doubt, knowing that, they're doing their best. There's not any hidden agenda It's okay to express emotion or to share, right? That emotional safety really helps address any mistrust staff may have. And that's different than physical safety, right? That's pretty straightforward. Protection from violence, protection from theft, protection from weapons. So you see there's a distinguishing the difference between these two. And we think about when we're working with people, right? Some of this may matter more to someone else. Emotional safety may matter more to someone than physical safety, and vice versa. If you're talking to another person, like for me, and I'll acknowledge I have a lot of privilege. I'm a really big dude, right? Got my awesome big beard. I don't think a lot about physical safety. I'm in a neighborhood of concern. You know, I've never really been threatened in that way. And so for me, well, emotional safety is a little bit more important, right? Scared I might say something, y'all laugh at me. We all dismiss what I'm saying. And so when you can incorporate, if part of your work is safety planning, incorporate who you're talking to in, their thoughts, incorporate into the safety planning and then adhering to it. So you all may not do safety planning, but maybe somebody else does safety planning. And so if there's a way then for all staff to be on the same page so that they can be consistent, that's going to go a long way. Now think back to as far as when I was talking about the brain and our threat response, right? It's that amygdala, when we don't feel safe, it's the guard dog that comes out, right? To respond to the threat until we feel safe, not the wise owl. And so think about what that means when you're working with someone. And if we can't access the rational side and the emotional side, it might make things more difficult. So safety is key. That's why we started it first. Right? When relationships are emotionally safe, the participant trusts the program, trusts the staff, they can give the benefit of the doubts. Right? When emotional safety that's lost, a lot of times that's where distrust comes from. Participants start looking for like hidden meanings, potential threats, reading into words and behaviors. So think about how that relates to the people you work with. How would you rate their trust, right? Their perception of safety. Here are some quotes that we just gathered through different listening sessions. Let you just read over that. Does any of that apply to folks in your program? You think any of them would say something similar? When I talk about language, there's one thing I want to highlight because there's a couple I read in here. I know I can act crazy, right? At times, but I'm not stupid, right? I hear the word crazy a lot. I don't love it. I think this one really illustrates a good point. Like participants can use language like this, like crazy. I know folks that I would work with be like, Warren, I'm just drunk, right? They can use those terminology. As the staff, we can't, right? We want to foster an environment of safety. And so we need to be really thoughtful about the words that we use. And so I wouldn't use words that are like labels, maybe someone's diagnosis or crazy, because that can be heard as pejorative, as judging, as increasing the stigma. And this is something that I learned. Like when I first got into the housing world, I used to refer to the participants I worked with as the homeless. And once I started getting a better understanding, I stopped doing that because the participants I worked with were a lot more than just their housing situation. And that there was stigma associated with that. Does that make sense? So we define safety. Here's some ways that it can look, right? When we think of covering physical and emotional safety, making sure common areas are welcoming, right? Privacy is respected. Upholding the dignity of individuals during discussions about them. Now notice, it doesn't say when they're present. Anytime you're talking about a participant, that you uphold their dignity. Similar thing here, communication is open, respectful, and compassionate. Now, this doesn't say with participants, with the tenants, it's with everybody. So here's the safety section from our assessment. And again, Shannon will get you a copy of these, but just go ahead and look this over. How does your program measure up? What are you already doing to address safety in a trauma-informed way? And most importantly, what's one, maybe more things that you can do right away to be more trauma-informed around safety? I'd love to hear some of the stuff that you're already doing in the chat section, even if it's not on this list or this category. What do you do, right, to address safety with participants that you work with, tenants in your program? So not everybody all at once. It's the way for us to share. Having uniforms. Darlene, yeah. So that's such a great point. I'm glad that you bring it up, because in my line of work, we were always very considerate about dress. And so one of the things in with some of the teams that I worked with, and this was in greater Minnesota, is that I would, the agency would have a policy around business casual attire. And with our program, I was like, I don't know, that could be a barrier for the participants that we work with. And so having a little bit more flexibility. But part of being trauma informed, having uniforms, is to designate who's staff and who's not. So, that was a scattered site model, being thoughtful about our dress. But in a site-based, maybe uniforms are important. Maybe the lanyard helps folks realize, okay, you're staff, you're not staff. You think of maintenance staff, right? Having the name tag, being able to identify who you are. You also allow people to call and request an appointment for work orders, and they're sharing the power, being able to have them have some sense of control. Any other? Thank you, Darlene. That's awesome. Perfect. Perfect example. I'll go ahead and I'll keep moving forward, but just in your mind, again, this is the value, right? As you look through this, and you'll have a PDF of this form that I encourage you to go over with your team and just say, like, what are some of the things we can do to move more towards being trauma informed? This next category, choice, right? Let's talk about choice. Sometimes it's the lack of choice or being forced to do something that contributes to an event being traumatic. So here, choice here refers to giving clients as much control over their treatment and their day-to-day activities as possible. Very similar to what Darlene was saying as far as allowing people to call and request an appointment for work orders, right? The experience of trauma routinely takes choice away from the victim entirely. Here's what some participants have said about that. some quotes about the lack of choice, right? And they felt, right? Check out some of the language here. I was forced to. I had to, right? They made me. The case manager didn't listen to me, right? Think about that language. What do you think the participants in your program would say around choice? So we want to give choice and control whenever possible, right? That's how we share the power with who we work with, right? When not possible, we want to provide context. For me, this came up around the subsidy in my work, the rental assistance subsidy. A lot of times participants didn't want to fill out all the forms that was needed, and they give pushback, right? And so then we couldn't turn the subsidy on without those forms, without that needed information. So one of the things that I did was I escalated the issue up to our state and HUD partners, Minnesota Housing and HUD. And we had conversations about what information was specifically required to turn on the subsidy and what wasn't. And then once we had that clarification, that understanding, we trained staff not just to rely on the answer, but to dig a little bit deeper to find out what was going on with the participant, right? Respect the choice, but to provide that extra context on why this information was needed in a really clear and concise way. And once we were able to do that, 99.9% of the time, the participant would choose to fill out the forms and give that personal information to get housing. But even if they didn't, we were being able to give them the right information so that they could make an informed choice. And I like saying it like that rather than saying something like giving them options. This is the power of language and being thoughtful how you say something. Options aren't ours to give, right? We're providing information for someone to make an informed choice. Implicitly, I'm giving you some options here. It's that power and control. And you're not saying it out loud, and I imagine that's not what many of us mean, but sometimes that's what's heard. Ways that choice, what can that look like in programs, right? Providing individuals with clear and appropriate messages about their rights, their responsibilities, the grievance policy. If they disagree with something, there's a route they can go to challenge it, right? But not just to have to accept it. Asking people, right, where they want to meet, where they want to stand. So think about, let me pull up the form here. And again, look over this form and where do you measure up? Right, what are you already doing? What's one more thing around choice that you can do to be more trauma informed? I'd love to hear any thoughts like what you're doing already or something that you want to try in your work. In the chat box, or if you want to unmute. It's not always easy. Oh, some of this stuff, in the work that I've done and just being more, like maybe I became aware of a blind spot that we have. That's really easy to get defensive. I'm not saying that's what you all mean, but it's kind of hard. I can't do that, Warren. This is the way we do things. That's beyond my power, right? That's above my pay grade.
Warren, this is Shannon.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe it'd be helpful in this, because in so many situations we have particularly with the group here today, you know, there's repairs that need to be done. There's access to somebody's home that really that needs to happen. You know, there are we as a staff, there are things we have to get done because of health, safety, a whole host of things. So I guess when maybe you can talk through some kind of strategies, some communications, you know, is there, you know, does it, you know, what could some people consider doing to, you know, again, move it forward, since, you know, but also because I think giving that choice or giving review it anyway, the amount of time, it doesn't always happen in an emergency situation, right?
Sure,
So
absolutely.
maybe think about kind of, some guidance around how to communicate and some strategies that you can, that folks can deploy when, you know, they're again in that interaction. And again, we as staff have to, you know, our requirements of what we have to do, but recognizing that who we're working with and need access or need permission and need them to think about the choice.
What that looks like,
how
in
we
that
give them their
context.
space. Give them this,
absolutely.
you know, so
Well,
you know where I'm going.
And you know, so the example I gave around choice with the subsidy, a lot of it was thinking about situations where I would have to identify, you know, the where the choice is, making sure that you're specific, that they know that they can make the decision. But then there's that providing that context piece, right? So I go back to that example that I gave with the rental assistance of someone not wanting to share information. So I think of in a different situation, like a situation you all may be in, like what Shannon's saying, where you have to go in there, is just providing the reason that we have to come in, what's going to happen, and to be a little bit prepared with being able to do that context. Sometimes it's harder off the cuff. Sometimes if we get some pushback and it's a little bit weird, we can start having a little bit of an emotional reaction, like, you know, as far as like, oh, I just need to get to my work. I just need to get to my work, right? I need to get to this job because I got 4 more others, right? Before lunch or before I can go home. And so recognizing that and being able just to practice a little bit of patience in the situation, because you're thinking how you'll be perceived. And someone may come at us and they're a little bit escalated, right? There's a little bit of energy there. And so just knowing that that's normal, right? We talk about choice. Sometimes it could be, hey, I can do this now, or I can come back and do this then. This, you know, and there's a little bit of validation you can do as far as like, this might not be the best time. I get that. I have some time later on today. Would that work for you? And just having that choice as far as whether it's this morning or this afternoon can go a long way. Does that make sense? Is that more helpful for you all? And we can do this as far as for each of these categories that we go, but throw out some situations too that you encounter that might be like, Warren, how would I be able to really do this? Or how would this look in this situation? But the biggest tools we have, and I'm completely recognizing that it takes time, is ways for people to feel heard. And a lot of times that's paraphrasing what we think their meaning is. Maybe we're paraphrasing, they're feeling emotional about something, or they're upset, or they're thrown off, right? And so just for ways for them to feel heard. And then, right, as that starts getting the better relationship, they're a little bit more receptive on what do we need to do. And what we're really talking about is a collaboration, a partnership, right? So collaboration, that refers to having a strong alliance with who we're working with, right? Having a good working relationship, a good working partnership. That's a big part of being trauma informed, right? Making sure that the partnership between the worker and the participant is effective. It takes effort. When it's not effective, this is what it looks like. A lot of it is, as far as it goes back to the perception of power and control. But we're trying to really get on the same page, right? To have that understanding, to have clear boundaries. And that's going to help a relationship run smoothly. When that stuff's not there, when the alliance is off kilter, right? That's disconnect. And what we're talking about today is being able to connect with someone. Is that making sense? And that's why I spent so much time talking about that right mindset of our working relationship in the collaboration. And a lot of this stuff will fit into probably other trainings that you heard: de-escalation, right? Person-centered practices. What's my role as the staff versus the tenant's role? And sometimes we have to be flexible, right? Flexible with our program rules or our policies and regs. I know in my line of work, I talk about, tailoring services to meet the participant needs. But what we really want to do is we don't want to come at this from a one-size-fits-all approach. And so what does that look like? Here are some examples. This third one I really want to highlight because I think it's applicable to many different roles, but having a culture of continuous learning about other people. Maybe it's their cultural practices and identity, but it's that tool of curiosity about what's going on with the person. My grandma used to say, once you think you know something, you quit learning. When I was 7, I didn't really know what she meant, right? Now at 44, working with people, that's a valuable tool. And so even just acknowledging that, you're going to do things that meet people's basic needs. They're going to feel heard. And maybe there's nothing you can really do about it, but just by listening, and you think about as far as, when you felt heard, how cathartic that felt, how connecting that could be. Right? And then it's going to help you as far as if there's stuff that you need to do, because then they're more likely to hear you. And I wonder if some of you already don't see that in the work that you do. In some of my experience, as far as in working with site-based programs, I've seen some of the maintenance staff have a little bit of a better relationship or connecting than the front desk staff. I'm not saying that's necessarily you guys, but that's something that I noticed. And part of it was that there was a chance for folks to be a little bit more authentic, not so attached to the policy. And there was a better collaboration, right? But what are your thoughts? Let me pop up the assessment, right? Are you able to be flexible? And again, it's the distinction between the relationship and the system, right? Again, the system's the policy. The relationship is how do I interact? And a lot of time we were just listening, right? We're validating where we can, and then we're providing context for stuff that we have to do. And so there's this understanding, right? We have an idea of where the participant is, the tenant is. They know what we have to do in our role with them. So maybe there's an issue, it's safety. Hey, I got to get this fixed. It's for your safety. We have to have standards, or the whatever it is. I mean, you probably know your language a little bit better than I do. But what that is moving is now towards trustworthiness, right? Clear boundaries, clear understanding. The client understands as far as what your role is, what you do, They're familiar with routines, with the structure, because we're consistent. You look here, this is what, when there isn't trustworthiness. This first one, I overheard 2 staff members talking about my diagnosis in front of other clients. Right? But think about, they're talking about my business in front of everyone. Well, I'm not going to share a lot with you. So again, how does that look in your work? And be clear from the start, right? We want to establish that proper boundaries with participants. We want to be consistent with our actions. Know that you're being watched, right? You can't just say, hey, trust me. It's something that you have to demonstrate. And those actions reflect how you're going to be perceived. And so as staff, we all want to be on the same page. We want to be consistent regarding interpreting the rules, expectations as far as how we behave within our role. If we have a job that we have to do, we want to be able to provide that notice, right? So they have that preparation time, so they know why we're there. Like that example I gave earlier with maintenance staff being trauma informed, that I've seen, maybe it's a uniform, maybe it's a name tag, something to show that they're a worker. If you have to go to a site, you provided the notice for the participants that you're going there to work on the furnace. It's going to be this, you're going to be here at around this time. It's going to take this long. When you're there, you identify yourself. Hey, maintenance, when you come in. Now, I know for some of you, you're coming into people's homes, so you have to knock so that it's expected. It's not throwing people off guard. While you're, in someone's home, maintaining those good interpersonal boundaries with the tenants, but also with other staff. And again, it's that consistency. It goes back to safety. So I'll let you look over here, right? And just think about like, okay, we're already doing a lot of that. That's great. And if there's something more that you can do, right? That moves you to be more trauma informed, right? Are you consistent when you have to come out? Or do you say we're going to come out, you don't come out because of whatever reason? And I'm not saying that like stuff doesn't come up, but if something does come up, are you reaching out to let somebody know why, what happened? Is that making sense? And that builds towards someone feeling empowered. I know, in your role, empowering, well, what is that? When, again, this is moving someone towards post-traumatic growth. In my line of work, it was being able to maintain their housing. More than once, I had to play referee between the property management and the tenant. And sometimes and sometimes when I wasn't available, right, the tenant ended up having that big blow up led to the choice between renewing the lease and not renewing the lease, or if there was a lease violation, moving more towards an eviction and not an eviction. And it's in our interest for folks to stay housed. When I would talk about as far as with when I would build relationships with landlords, it was my interest to get the person housed, to have them stay into housing. It was the participants' interest to be housed, right? And to not be out on the streets, but also the landlord, and having that unit occupied, filled, helped as far as sustainability of the business. And so those are 3 goals we all have. And so empowering helps keep the participant, right, moving forward, staying housed. Oops. So again, as far as participants' thoughts when they feel disempowered, and sometimes we might have to say something as the worker, right? I mean, and it's valid. it's some kind of a direct thing that we need to address. But we really have to pay attention to the messaging, right? If it's disempowering, if it contributes to this learned helplessness. Because we always want to be working towards this, no matter what our role is. Because like I said before, when the participant is empowered, anything is possible. And I've seen it. I've seen as folks that have come from a long history of homelessness. I mentioned that one individual, 20 years living on the streets, was able to find housing, maintain housing. And it was all with as far as the supports provided to them. So what I'm talking about is really creating a culture, in your work that is empowering. That's going to help achieve this for participants. So what's your atmosphere like? You and your role, every contact that you have with the participant, are you able to validate what they have to say, affirm what they have to say? Think about that. Sometimes it's easy to say, hey, that's not my business. I don't know anything about that, right? Is that affirming? Or can you just listen? I see why you'd say that. Yeah, well, let me connect you to the front desk. Or I think the best way, as I understand it, might be with the front desk. You want me to mention something to, Liz or Pam or Gary for you? And I understand we got to sometimes stay in our lane, right? But as far as we don't want to come from just dismissing. Any thoughts, any questions? Pop up the assessment sheet and just kind of, again, look that over. How does your program measure up? Think about from the relationship side or the system side. When there's a tough incident, right? Is there a debriefing process? Meaning, is there a chance for your team to come together and who was impacted by that tough incident and talk about it? Talk about as far as what vicarious trauma does, how does that impact me, and what symptoms may I have around that? Is that part of the work that you're doing? When an agency takes the step to become trauma-informed, every part of its organization, management, service delivery system is addressed and potentially modified to include a basic understanding of how trauma impacts the life of individuals receiving services. Every part. So, we're talking with you with a lot of maintenance staff, front desk staff, not just the support service staff, finance, leadership. For me, it was the board. And then when I'm talking to you, I don't want you to think of it as that this is a one-step process. I understand trauma now. I'm trauma informed because I went to a 2-hour training with Warren. No, but this is a continuous process, right? It's just like I said with my grandma. Once you think you know something, you quit learning. So we're always learning, right? And so again, as far as what can you build off of today? The first thing would be that assessment. But what we're talking about is like when organizations become trauma informed, it's really like a 5+ year process. And it's not flipping a switch of, hey, I'm going to be trauma informed in this part of my life, but not this part of my life, right? If that makes sense. Then this is kind of how you are, and recognizing that it's a journey, right? Especially if this is something brand new, if you're transforming the way that you interact or your program or agency acts. And even if you feel, oh, well, I'm pretty much there, you still need to maintain that culture. Build that awareness with your coworkers. like I said, it's very often you'll hear something like, God, right? What is wrong with them? Ah. And so when we hear that, whether it's with us or a coworker, we just need to pause, recognize that it could be trauma symptoms, and maybe we say, hey, I wonder if that's not coming from some kind of trauma. Maybe there's a different way that we can address this issue, or maybe we call in the support service staff if it's a really big issue. So building awareness, right? Supporting the culture of staff wellness. It's okay if we feel this might be a little bit beyond what I can do, right? Or, oh, this situation, right, really stirred stuff inside of me. There's that self-awareness piece. Because if we're working with individuals, we're hearing their stories, that takes a toll on us. And if unchecked, right, that can lead to this concept called compassion fatigue. Colloquially, we call it burnout. And we need to recognize this. We need to understand as far as what our signs may be when we're experiencing things like this compassion fatigue, burnout. Maybe we're having intrusive thoughts after work. We're thinking about work when we don't want to be thinking about work. I want to make sure that we're hiring staff that align with trauma-informed values, that it's not just an us or them thing. Right? And continue to work to have a safe, emotional, social, physical environment. So I want to leave you with one final thought. So I have times for some questions, but I talk about us, and you probably picked up, when I was talking about presence and awareness. Essentially, you have to switch on. You have to put your focus on as far as your environment when you're at work, when you're working with a participant. You got to pay attention, right? But when you're not at work, make a conscious effort to switch off. Meaning that, oh, okay, I'm no longer in my role as, right, whatever your job title is. Now I'm going to spend time with things outside of work, right? With friends. For me, I make a conscious effort when I'm not at work. Okay, I'm going to be with my family. I'm going to spend time with them, not going to think about work. Come up with a ritual. I mean, for me, it used to be the car ride home. But now it's just taking some breaths. It's telling myself that I'm switching off. This is going to help us have that balance. With that, I've come to the end of the training. Here is my contact information. Here's the QR code. That's a link to an evaluation of today's training. But I do have some time. I know we have a couple minutes. I want to value your time. If there's any thoughts or questions, I can be more specific on issues that you'd want to discuss. And again, I appreciate you sitting with me this morning for this hour.
Well,
A lot of
thanks.
silence.
Yeah, right? It was a lot to take in. I mean, I think it asks, particularly since we do operate in a space that's incredibly highly regulated by HUD. So I think it asks a lot of our system to reconsider how we again, I just think of all the forms and the information required, and that again, many of that is, it's not our doing. We would change it if we could, And so, but the challenge of what we have to do, because we can't. And so then we have to figure out how best to proceed that does, at least where we can, provide choice and empowerment and listening to those that we're working with and partnering with. So.
And I think that's absolutely, and for the relationship side, right, that's what we can control.
Yeah.
Is the way that we interact, that sometimes we can't control the system and there's systemic barriers. But when you look at your policies, and this is something I learned working with HUD, is sometimes they're incredibly vague, right? And there are choices that we can make, conversations we can make. And so I think that's something as a team, and maybe that's a leadership, more of the leadership and not necessarily our role, though hopefully we're involved in our input on some of those conversations on what can we escalate to our HUD rep, right? If there's something that, oh, this might be a pretty quick fix.
Well, and I do think
quick,
for
but,
lots, yeah, I do think that for a lot of us, it's also, that's the form, we were trained on, or the process that we were trained on, and we haven't really, sat down as a group to say, hey, how much of this is required, how much of it could be just adjusted, because like you said, so much of this is in the communication and the delivery too. So, well, Warren, I thank you for sharing this. Again, for the folks on the call, I'll be following up with providing that checklist and materials, because Warren will, I don't think I've seen it in my inbox yet, but you will send me that form and I'll get it out to everybody.
I'll send it to you right now.
That'd be great.
Actually, yeah.
That would be great. So appreciate your time this morning, and everyone, have a great rest of the week. And our session 5 of the maintenance series is coming, let me check make sure I do the right date, Wednesday, July 12th. So that's our next one. So put that on your calendar. And again, it will be at that 8:30 start time. Thanks all. Have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everyone.